Good morning. You know, I had a little chuckle that Jerry had to come and give the logistics guy a microphone. I feel like I'm ready this morning. You know, I shaved, I cut my hair, or at least I washed my head, and that's not funny. But I'm ready to go. I've been excited about this opportunity. Been praying that I don't mess it up like I think every good speaker does. That hopefully I've got something good to impart to you, and I believe I do. And I just want to say it's a privilege to be here, and that's a fact for every child of God. It's not just because I'm getting a chance to speak. It is a privilege to be called one of God's children, and it's a privilege to be in a building full of people that are also children of God. And I think it's important we always take pause and just recognize that fact. I do want to say thank you to Aaron. He did a good job lining up the thoughts this morning on what we're going to be talking about. Keeping our eyes on Jesus is obviously our theme for this year, but he nailed it with those ideas that he shared, and I hopefully we can keep building on that. The title is, Can You See Jesus from There? And that's really a question that I want us to have in our minds throughout this. We're going to go through kind of a mental exercise, and Aaron used a phrase that I'm glad he said, your mind's eye. And we can't see Jesus with our eyes. We can't sit here in our seats and see him with our eyes. But in our mind's eye, we need to be asking that question all the time. Can I see Jesus from here? Is this decision that I'm about to make, does it involve him? Is he there with me in this decision? Or am I somehow blinded or separated from him because of the choices that I'm making? Life is certainly full of ups and downs. And that's something you're going to see in this lesson. You're going to see it from the standpoint of Peter, I hope, and the ups and downs that he experienced. And I want you to kind of put yourself in his shoes as we think about that. You know, all the different emotions we have that hit us in the face. Sometimes right after a great thing happens, a bad things happen. Sometimes we have a string of bad things or a string of good things. And those can all really tend to weigh on us and affect us in ways that we need to be aware of. And in the midst of all those, we're going to be asking ourselves and each other, can you see Jesus from there? I'm going to be asking you to follow along in your Bible for a lot of these passages. So when you see a verse come up on the screen, I want you to be, turning there and reading along at least. I'm going to make a lot of interjections into the reading as we're going through it. But this first story is about when Jesus calls Peter. And I can sympathize with what Peter must have been going through. The Bible doesn't record all the details about how Peter was feeling and whatnot, but it does indicate that he was fishing all night. And as a tradesperson, I understand that you have to go where the work is when the work needs to be done, when you have time to go do the work. And sometimes that puts you in weird times of the day. And I can only imagine if I had fished all night and come up empty-handed, where my state of mind might have been. I worked and basically failed at my task. And then, this story kind of is framed in that context. So that's my picture of what I feel like after a hard day of work. Some of us may look like that all the time when we start the day, but this is jumping into a story after a hard day of work. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. I'm going to begin reading there in verse 1. It says, Now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, this is talking about Jesus, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats lying at the edge of the lake. But the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets, because that's what you do when you're done. Okay, it's not like, hey, let's wash the nets for fun, go fishing again. That's what you do when you're finished. So they're washing the nets, and verse 3, and he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, I'm sure that was on purpose, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered and said, Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. Now, I don't know much about Jesus' relationship with Peter or Peter's with Jesus before this. I don't know if Simon Peter knew who this was. He calls him master, but I don't know if that was just a term of reverence because he knew something about him. But what comes to my mind immediately is I wonder how long the pause was, if there was a pause there after Jesus asks and Simon made this answer. Kind of hangs his head a little bit and says, "We've been fishing all night, and this is tough." But nonetheless, he doesn't get terse, or he doesn't get oppositional. He goes along with it. But I wonder where my mind would have been after a long day of work if God calls on me to do something when I'm beat tired. When it's time, you can't always pick when it's time to serve God. Sometimes the opportunity is now, and it doesn't matter what you've been doing ahead of that. And so I just want you to kind of put yourself in Peter's shoes and think, if I had been Peter, I'm worn out, I put my stuff away, I'm done, it's all packed away, we're wrapping it up, fixing to go hit the bed that I've been thinking about for the last 6 hours. Could you see Jesus from there? Can you see Jesus from that location when you're beat tired? We read on now, second half of verse 5, Peter says, "But I will do as you say and let down the nets." When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For amazement had seized him and his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And so the question I want us to consider here for a moment is, have you ever been just filled with amazement at what God has done to care for you? Have you ever just been struck by it? I think, somehow in this situation, there's probably a lot of reasons. A fisherman who knows how fish work is probably just amazed at the sheer fact that we were just fishing here, and now we've got this amazing catch. But I can't think it's hidden that in that story that somehow he must have seen that, this man is just provided for me. This guy who I'm learning about, who I'm figuring some things out about, has just completely provided for me and my fellow fishermen. We're not going home empty-handed. We're not going to be sad and dejected. We actually have something to show for our work. And so I just want you to think about that. You've been filled with amazement because of what God's done for you. That's what my initial comments were about this morning. Do you ever just pause and say, look at what God has done to make me one of his children? And I think the answer to the next question is pretty obvious, is that when you're in that moment, can you see Jesus from there? Yeah, I think that's an easy moment. When God amazes you, when God fills your mind up with blessing, it's pretty easy to see him from that moment. And so it stands to reason, I guess, if you read on there in second half, I guess, of verse 10, it says, "And Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Do not fear. From now on you will be catching men.' And when they had brought their boats to the land, they left everything and followed him." Have you ever left everything and followed Jesus? Or have you ever left anything and followed Jesus? You ever decided you're not going to live a certain way, put a past lifestyle behind? It creates some struggle, doesn't it? These men had to go home and talk to their families and say, "Okay, by the way, I don't do what I used to do anymore. I'm following Jesus." And when you give things up like that, that can present challenges to your life. When you have massive change that comes into your world, this is a relevant question. Can you see Jesus from there? Maybe you saw him when you began. Maybe you saw him when you were amazed. But at some point, perhaps the amazement fades a little bit, and you're just running on some type of faith that's not quite as powerful as what you saw. Can you see Jesus from there? Another story here, a little bit later on, and I'm not going to try to establish a timeline here in anything that I'm discussing, but later on, there's a scenario where Jesus feeds about 5,000 people. And this story follows that. So Matthew 14, verses 21 through 33. Jesus and Peter walk on the water is what we're going to be talking about in this story. Verse 21 of Matthew 14, verse 21. It says, "There were about 5,000 men who ate besides women and children. And immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. but the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, which I think we would probably say the wee hours of the morning, in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And so I've never seen this other than in pictures that people have tried to draw. I don't know what it looks like exactly when a man is walking on rough seas, but I can imagine it would be pretty amazing. Waves crashing and moving. I've been tossed around in the ocean before on a surfboard and in a boat, and it's a helpless moment. And here Jesus is just walking across that scene as he approaches the boat. It says in verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." I suppose that's a reasonable line of thought when you're a fisherman and you're out in the middle of the ocean and you know that that doesn't happen. People don't walk on the ocean. But here comes somebody, and it's not like anybody was like, "Hey, wait a second, that's definitely Jesus." They're freaked out. They're terrified. And so to me, there's a picture here of our lives. Have you ever had a hard time seeing Jesus in the midst of a storm? Have you ever had a hard time making out the outline of God trying to work, trying to help you to move a certain direction, but you couldn't see it because either you had the wrong mental template, you were overlaying something else over it, and it just looked scary, it just looked frightening, it just looked terrifying. And then the question that follows, can you see Jesus from there? I'd say it's pretty hard at that moment when you're losing your cool. It's pretty hard to see him. It's pretty hard to understand that you're just supposed to follow him when we have an obscured view. Finishing verse 26 now. It says, "And they cried out in fear." And I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I've never been on the ocean and so terrified that I was crying out in fear. I've thought, well, this is it, we're going to die. But I've never cried out in fear. So this is like a next level, that they were crying out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." What wonderful words to hear in that moment. You're not dying, it's not a ghost, the boat's not fixing to be overwhelmed. It's me, I'm here. Don't be afraid. And Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." There's Peter. We see a great snapshot of who Peter is. Peter's always ready to jump to it, to hop into action. And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. Now again, we don't know how long Peter was walking on the water. He was walking long enough to come toward Jesus. And he was walking on the water. Can't miss that detail. He was standing on the water like Jesus was. He was empowered by God to do that. And so in that moment, Peter takes a terrifying and a confusing situation and turns it into a moment of faith. And he's like, yeah, all this is happening, but if that's actually Jesus, I know I can walk towards him. Maybe we don't pause on that long enough sometimes to think, that's a good thing. Good job, Peter. He saw through the storm. He saw through the terror. And just ask yourself, in situations like that, can you see Jesus from there yourself? Would you be staying in the boat? Would you be hunkering down? Would you be hiding? Or would you be standing up and walking towards God? Do you ever jump up and drive forward like Peter did? Maybe some of us do it a little bit with too little thought. We just jump up and we move. Maybe some of us don't move at all. But ask yourself in those moments when you're confronted with those situations, can you see Jesus from there? Verse 30, it says, "But seeing the winds, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" And so it's one of those scenes I would have loved to have seen. I don't know if he sunk, like a rock quick, or if it was just started to perceive that he's moving down. But he realizes that he's broken his focus on trusting in God. He's broken his gaze, as it were, on Jesus. And he says immediately, "Lord, save me." And Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him. So Peter quickly finds himself in the midst of it. Even though he had jumped out in faith and he had done a good thing, he immediately finds himself distracted. Pretty obvious question there for us, isn't it? Have you ever found yourself distracted? Have you ever been like, I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know that I need to be serving God. I know I should be walking with him, but yet I'm really focused on this other stuff over here, this other thing over that way. We live in a world full of distractions. We live in a life that seems like every day it is over-engineered to distract us in another way. And so an important question, when you're distracted, when you're not focused on God, can you see Jesus from there? Are you letting yourself get into those situations where you don't even know which way to look to find Him because you're so distracted by the storm that is happening around you? Can you see Jesus from there when your eyes are focused on something other than Him? And reading on now in verse 31. So Jesus took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly the Son of God." So another amazing scene. Like, first of all, Jesus, never misses an opportunity to teach. He points out very clearly that, Peter, there's an equation between, keeping your eyes and faith in me and staying above the storm, and then taking your eyes off of me, getting distracted and sinking. Very clear equation there. But it says when they reached the boat, the storm just stopped. No more storm. And everybody was suddenly amazed. They were amazed at what they'd seen. They were amazed at what happened. They were overtaken, as it were, by the power of God. They saw how wonderful it was what Jesus had done. And so have you ever just dropped what you were doing? Have you ever just put everything aside, kind of canceled everything else out of your mind and just worshiped God? It seems like a pretty spontaneous reaction here in this moment. Hopefully, that's what we've been doing this morning. Hopefully, we've wiped everything else out of our mind. We didn't need a storm or Jesus to pull us into a boat. But all of us here are in this building because we trust in God in some fashion, because Jesus has pulled us into the boat. We need to be the kind of people that are about worshiping God for who He is and what He's done. And the question there, of course, can you see Jesus from there? I'd say it's pretty easy to see Jesus when we're in this room. When there is no storm, when there's no wave, when there's no wind. We're surrounded by people that we know support us in that same endeavor. That's a great thing. I'm not undermining or belittling that at all. It's wonderful that we can all be here together. But we also have to remember that when we leave this building, we're going to be in the storm sometime. Maybe immediately, maybe in a few hours, we're going to be back in the storm. And we need to be able to see Jesus then just like we can see Him now. I would actually say that being in this room and the fact that we're surrounded by people that help us to see Jesus is just one more great argument for why we should get together and worship God as a team, as a group of His children. Just want to look for a moment here kind of on a graph, and you could certainly agree with me on this graph because, there's not any data points plotted out in the scriptures. It just, to me, Peter was at some type of a low when Jesus found him fishing. He was worn out, he was beat, he was done, and He calls him. And things are going good. He wants to become a fisher of men. He trusts in Jesus initially in that story. This next story that we just covered where he's walking on the water, pretty cool scene. Peter's trusting and things are going good. But then immediately after that kind of peak, that crescendo of service to God and life with Jesus going great, comes this pit, this valley, where he's actually literally, physically sinking into the water. And I just see this reminder that sometimes when you think you are standing, it's probably a good idea to take heed lest you fall. Ask yourself, can I actually see Jesus in this situation? Am I ready for the next situation where it's going to be more of a challenge to me? And then ultimately, Jesus pulls him up out of the water and he's like, okay, I get it. Once again, I get it. But we see this pattern in ourselves. We see this pattern in the apostles. This up and down, this I trust, I forget, I don't trust, I take my eyes off Jesus. Oh, I need to get my eyes back on Jesus again. And if we're not aware of that in ourselves, our decisions won't be as great. Our thinking, our judgment won't be as sound. So we have to see that, we're not that much different from Peter. Luke chapter 22. What about during confusion, during rebuke? Anybody here ever been corrected or rebuked? Told in firm words. And I don't mean as a child, I mean in your adult life. Burt, that was a really dumb thing you said. That was a really bad idea you just carried out in front of everybody. That can be a challenge. That can be a real real disappointment. That can hurt us, and we can be challenged to be able to see Jesus at all in those moments. In Luke 22, beginning in verse 47, we're going to see where Peter strikes out with a sword, and Jesus basically tells him, stop. I think I know how I would have felt in that moment. Verse 47 says, and this is in the garden. This is as the guard has come to take Jesus by force. Not sure that everybody with Jesus knows what's going on. Jesus certainly understands that this is the time he must be taken. This is the time for him to make his final approach, as it were, in aviation terminology, that he is going to die. What he has told the apostles would happen is now about to happen. In verse 47, it says, while he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came, and one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And so keep in mind that Jesus has previously told some of these men, or perhaps all of these men, that he's going to die. And yet Peter has told Jesus, no, you're not going to die. He got rebuked for that. Jesus has also told Peter specifically that I'm absolutely going to die. This is going to happen. And then one of them, verse 50, if you can imagine who. John 18 tells us it was Peter. The other Gospels are kind, I guess you might say, to Peter. Don't reveal his name. Verse 50 here, it says, and one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, stop. No more of this. And he touched his ear and he healed him. And so have you ever been confused about how you should move forward? You ever been confused about how you should act, especially spiritually? You know you should be doing something. You've got zeal, you've got energy inside of you. You want to do something good, but you don't exactly know how to use it. I think that's probably an apt description of what's going on with Peter here. He's feeling a lot of stuff. He wants to go forward. He thinks this is forward. He just doesn't get that that's not what the kingdom's going to look like. It's not going to look like the end of a physical sword. And he just acts, and he meets, especially when it's your mentor, when it's the person that means the most to you in the world tells you, just stop. That's not what we're about. That must have hurt. That must have been challenging. And if you've ever been confronted with a situation like that, could you see Jesus from there? Is that where your mind was at? Or were you just frustrated? Were you just seeing red? Were you just so, down in the mouth? I'm sad now because somebody told me to knock it off. I can imagine that was a big part of what was going on in Peter's mind. And it's a challenge for us to see Jesus in those moments. Luke 22:54 through 62. Luke 22:54 through 62. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. In verse 54 it says, having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance, and after they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting among them. And the servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, said, this man was with him too. But he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. A little later another saw him and said, you are one of them too. But Peter said, man, I am not. After about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean too. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you were talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Verse 61, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, before rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And then he went out and he wept bitterly. So I guess in one sense, in that moment, you could ask Peter, hey Peter, can you see Jesus from here? And he absolutely could, because Jesus turned and was looking at him. But in those moments before that, If you'd ask Peter that same question, hey, while you're being challenged, while you're being attacked for who you are, while you're being told that it's really, really stupid to be following this guy, he's a waste of your time. Don't you understand our culture's moving a totally different direction than that guy? In the middle of that kind of challenge, if you'd ask Peter, hey, can you see Jesus from there? I would have to think the answer would be no. He didn't see Jesus at all. All he could see was the moment he was in, the suffering, the pain, I don't like the way that I'm being treated right now. These people are acting like I don't belong here. Maybe they're going to hurt me because they're hurting Jesus. And have you ever felt deeply confused in life like Peter probably did in those moments? Have you ever wanted to fight for your beliefs but you weren't sure how? Have you ever been called to sacrifice yourself for Jesus, but the way that you wanted to sacrifice for him didn't look like what he wanted? Have you ever felt yourself sliding down the slope with no way to stop? I can just picture this momentum that it must have felt as Peter's just getting out of there, like, I just got to get away from this whole scene. Have you ever felt fully and completely exposed in your sinfulness? Imagine that's where Peter was at when Jesus turned and looked at him. Oh boy, he knows. And man, does he ever know. Can you see Jesus from there in those moments? Is Jesus the first one you look for? Is he the way that you aim your face? Or do you turn inward? Do you turn to some vice? Do you turn to some sin that will help you to forget about it? Can you see Jesus from there? And we see the same kind of an up and down line here, that Peter has this peak, I'm ready to fight, I'm ready to die. And he makes some bold statements, probably fueled by hubris and pride and some other things that aren't healthy, some other things that blind us. And then when it's not, when Peter's will isn't the same as God's will, he starts this downward slope. Jesus tells him to stop. He denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus looks at Peter. Peter's heading in a bad direction at that moment. John chapter 21. Have you ever been trying to escape your responsibility? Have you ever decided, I'm just going to walk? That's it. I'm heading out. See y'all, drop the mic, peace out, whatever. It kind of seems like that's where Peter's at. Forgive me if you think I'm reading more into it than what's here. The Bible doesn't tell us he dropped a mic or anything like that. But he seems like he's heading out. John 21 verse 3. And there's already many other things that have transpired between the crucifixion and this moment. It says that in this passage that we're going to read. But John 21 verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we will also come with you. And they went out and got into the boat. And that night they caught nothing. And so maybe you've got a firm argument. So maybe Peter's just trying to go back to the beginning. This certainly resembles the beginning. Maybe that was where he expected to find Jesus. Your theory is as valid as mine. But what it seems like to me is a man that's beaten, a man that's worn out, that's weary, and he just wants to go back to something that he knows. And so I'd ask you, have you ever felt like that? Have you ever been like, you know what, I'm just gonna go back to something I know. I'm just gonna go back to the way my life was. It's been a challenge. This has been the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in my entire life, following Jesus. I'm just gonna go back to something I know. I do think it's interesting that right there in the verse, and they caught nothing. It's kind of a metaphor for life. When you try to go back from where you came from, when you try to return to the world that God pulled you out of, you will catch nothing that's of any value. You'll come up with empty nets. When you do that, can you see Jesus from there? Obviously not. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen these feelings charts before. And I don't see a lot of colors, and I don't think I feel a lot of feelings. But there's like 27 on this chart or something like that, maybe more. Some research says there's more than that, more emotions than that. But I think things like this help us to understand that no matter where you land on this chart, no matter what you're going through, what your situation is making you feel, you need to ask yourself in that moment, can I see Jesus from here? Am I capable of controlling my mind to keep it focused on Jesus no matter what feeling I'm moving through? And with Peter, everything that we've talked about with him, I can only imagine what Peter must have felt. I don't know if he was a terribly emotional man. I don't know if he was stoic. But can you see Jesus in the midst of all of those feelings? John 21, verse 4. If you know this story, you might be able to anticipate what we're getting at. John 21, verse 4. It says, "But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus." So they're out there not catching anything, and Jesus is standing on the beach aware of them. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" And so I don't know, again, my tradesman mentality comes in, and I'm thinking, who's that on the shore anyways, Tell me about my fish. They don't know who it is. They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch." So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, you got to love John for this, it's just John's personality. He's like, "Peter, Peter, it's the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, because he still hasn't figured it out yet, John had to tell him, he put on his outer garment, because he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. That's classic Peter right there to me. He's like, if that's Jesus over there, I'm heading that direction. And in that moment, I think you can say absolutely Peter could see Jesus from there. And when you're in that moment, when you realize I've been distant from God, I've been away from Him, and you see Him, you figure out the direction you should have been gone, that's an easy question to answer. Can you see Jesus from there after you've suffered, after you put yourself into a situation that wasn't helpful to your relationship with God? Absolutely. When you see Him, you're ready to go. It seems like he could see Jesus from there. Verse 8, but the other disciples, of course, more self-controlled, realized somebody had to bring the boats and the fish in. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you've now caught." Simon went up and drew the net to the land, full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." I love this part. None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifest to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And I would just add my opinion, the third time, and probably in some ways the most important time, because some things really sink in this moment. So when you see Jesus' handiwork, when you hear the Word of God, when you hear Jesus' Word, when you hear Jesus speak and you hear God speak from the Scriptures to you, and they address your sin and they tell you that you're doing wrong, when you're sitting with your eyes fixed on Jesus, staring into the face of God and His Word, can you see Jesus from there? I think in this story, absolutely, they could see Jesus, no doubt. There's more to this story. We're not going to continue on the pattern. Peter definitely understands that he needs to be taking care of God's work after this. It all gets filled in. But I want us to think about a couple of scriptures as we begin to roll down the slope towards closing this lesson. Romans 8:37 through 38. But in all of these things we overwhelmingly conquer through Him who loved us. For I'm convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. If we keep our eyes on Jesus. You see, I can choose at any moment to just say, you know what, I'm not gonna keep my eyes fixed on him. I'm gonna look away. I'm gonna separate myself from the most powerful influence, the only influence that can ultimately save me. And I can decide to make myself separate and outside of this protective sphere that God is outlining here. We've got to keep our eyes on Jesus. Hebrews chapter 12, we'll go ahead and read the source text, so to speak, for our theme. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne. So let's lay that stuff aside that distracts us. Anything that would get in between my eyes and Jesus, let's get it out of the way so that I can keep constant, vigilant eye contact, as it were, with him. And so no matter what storm comes up in your life, whether it's good feelings, bad feelings, whether it's success, whether it's failures, all those things can tend to rock the boat. We've got to be ready and committed to keeping our eyes on Jesus. Galatians 5:16, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. Just going back to that equation we established in the boat, and maybe out of the boat too, with Jesus and Peter. Eyes on Jesus, you stay above the storm. Eyes off of Jesus, eyes on the storm. Wherever you want to put your eyes, anywhere else, sink beneath the waves of despair. It's easy to understand. Maybe it's abundantly harder to do. So questions for you to consider in your own mind. Are you positioning yourself so that you can see Jesus at all times? I've often thought that a lot of times we make decisions in life that are based on physical concerns, physical considerations. And then somewhere after the fact, I'm just speaking of human nature that we frequently observe. After the fact somewhere, we're like, oh yeah, and does God fit into this plan too? But how backwards? How incorrect? We need to make sure that we're positioning, wherever we're taking ourselves, that we are positioning ourselves in that decision so that we can see Jesus. And if I can see ahead of time, that decision is going to obliterate, or it's going to occlude or block my ability to see him. I don't need to go that direction. I don't need to move over there. Are you choosing to set your face toward Jesus in every circumstance? Because we all have those little areas we want to wall off in ourselves, don't we? Well, I face Jesus most of the time. I'm eyes on Jesus, eye contact with him most of the time, except for, when I'm really, really over in that state of mind. And in that state of mind, that's just for me. We've got to make sure that we don't let ourselves live that way. We've got to make sure that we set our face towards Jesus in every circumstance. Are you refusing choices that would block your view of Jesus? That might mean that you can't go certain places. That might mean that you can't have certain friends. That might mean that you can't watch certain movies or indulge in certain entertainment. There's certain restrictions that we need to place on ourselves so that we can keep our focus on Jesus. And ask yourself, are you making those difficult choices? And are you looking for Jesus regardless of how your feelings are pressuring you? Well, I don't feel like taking care of Justin today. I don't feel like worshiping with my brethren. I don't feel like living up to the standard that God has set for me. Taking our eyes off of Jesus like that and putting them on our feelings is just as foolish as Peter staring at the waves that had no power over him because of the man, Jesus, the Son of God, that he should have been focused on. And so the lesson is yours. Where are you right now? I imagine that if we all had to write down on a little slip of paper where we're at, where you at emotionally, where you at spiritually, that there'd be a wide variety of answers. But I can tell you that the question is the same for all of us. That no matter where you are, no matter what you're going through, no matter what your past has been, you need to ask yourself, can I see Jesus from where I'm at? And if you can't, you need to fix it. There was a time in my life when I walked in darkness. There's a time in everybody's life in this room where they walked in darkness. And thank God that I saw the gospel, that it was shared with me, and that I came to understand I needed to be pulled out of that ocean, out of that dark place, and I needed to serve Jesus. So if you're in this room today and everything I've said has just been a confusing mess, you're like, what is he talking about? Well, we need to talk more. Because Jesus is literally the Savior of the world. He wants everybody to be saved and to be with Him and His Father in heaven. If that's something that you're interested in, then you can be a part of that. We can teach you more. We can talk to you more. If you're ready this morning, we can baptize you into Christ. If you're subject to this invitation, please come forward while we stand and sing.